Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to look at the last letters sent to and from George Mallory. As a background, there's a popular story that George Mallory promised to leave a photograph of his wife, Ruth, on the summit. As no photograph was found on Mallory's body, some have taken this to imply he reached the summit. However, the main problem with that theory is there is no clear evidence Mallory had a photograph of Ruth with him on the expedition. The letters from Mallory seem to indicate that he had no such photo of Ruth. However, George did write to Ruth, thanking her for mailing a photograph of their children, and it is probably that photo he left on the summit, as it was not found on his body nor in any of his possessions. While this is certainly not conclusive proof that Mallory reached the summit, the most likely explanation is that a proud father carried a photograph of his children that he had recently received as he climbed the mountain. He also likely carried a letter from his wife, as his body was found carrying letters from his brother, his sister, and a friend. As neither the photograph of his children nor a letter from his wife were found on his body, it is just another piece of evidence that goes along with the Everest-sized mountain of evidence that Mallory and Irvin reached the summit and perished on the descent, just as the vast majority of deaths on the summit climbs occur on the descent. The bulk of Mallory's last letters were originally published in the 1924 expedition report, The Fight for Everest, which was published in 1925. However, recently, Magdalen College of Cambridge scanned copies of all of Mallory's letters, those that he wrote to Ruth and those that were found on his body, as well as one that was in his possession lower down on the mountain. The first thing that is immediately apparent is that significant portions of the letters were redacted when they were first published in 1925. The missing pieces primarily relate to personal issues with Mallory's family, but there is also Mallory's assessment of the fitness of various climbers written on May 16th, which provides some insight into Mallory's choice of Irvin. While the letters were always available to researchers who could make the trip out to Cambridge, the availability online greatly expands access to these valuable sources, so let's take a look at what they tell us. Let's start with the last letter Ruth wrote to Mallory, which has survived. It is dated March 3rd, 1924. In it, Ruth complains about the cold weather, having her period, and the family finances. Of these, the problems with the finances are the most relevant. I have heard from Mr. Raxworthy. My bank balance is overdrawn £823 and yours $112. That is $935 in all. He suggests we sell our 500-pound Vickers 4%, which would bring in £400, and a 400-pound National War Bond for £420. If we get $2,500 for the Holt, we need only sell the Vickers. I think so. I will tell him only to do that for the present. The Vickers appears to be referring to a bond issued by the Vickers Company. Using a basic online calculator, £935 in 1924 would be 71,000 pounds today, or approximately $91,000. Now, they were planning on selling the Holt, which is their family home. Ruth's father had purchased the six-bedroom home for £1,600 just prior to their marriage in 1915, and the title remained in Ruth's name. The name of the house, the Holt, is said to mean either copse of trees or an otter's den. But the plan to sell the Holt had been decided upon well prior to Mallory leaving. Mallory was going to take a new job lecturing up in Cambridge, and he had leased a new house known as the Herschel House, or more accurately, Ruth's father had leased the house, paying £4,000 for a 68-year-long lease. Thus, the plan seemed to be to liquidate some additional assets to pay off the debts. It looks like Ruth was planning to use the proceeds from the sale of the Holt to pay back her father what he had paid for it, and that is why they need to sell the additional bond. And while certainly not facing financial ruin, the Mallory family finances had always presented a problem, and Ruth's father was also subsidizing her with £750 a year to supplement their income. In comparison, when Mallory was a schoolmaster at Charterhouse prior to the first Everest expeditions, his salary was just £270 per year. More recently, Mallory was given an external lecturer position at Cambridge, where he would lecture on history. His salary for that was £350 per year, and he would receive some extra lecturing fees, which could add up to about £150 per year. Thus, George Mallory's family was still being massively subsidized by Ruth's father. In terms of the timing, the letter is dated March 3rd, and in a letter dated March 17th and 18th, 1924, Mallory writes to Ruth, Your first letter to me should reach Bombay 2 days after us, so I should only have 2 days in Darjeeling to wait for it. Given that on March 18th, Mallory was expecting to receive the first of Ruth's letters shortly, it appears the March 3rd letter was indeed the first one sent by Ruth, and it would not be received by Mallory until well after March 18th. Of interest in Mallory's March 18 letter is the particular attention he paid to the oxygen systems and crampons. I have studied the oxygen apparatus and gone through lists of stores and invoices so as to get to know exactly what we have that we shall want from base camp on, and have my own list in a notebook. The one serious omission is crampons, nothing but the old-fashioned heavy kind. It is very disappointing. I made a great point of that with the equipment people. It means we shall have to cut steps up the final slope, I suppose. The oxygen apparatus is going to be awkward to carry, and particularly to cut steps when wearing it will be difficult. What is interesting from that is that Mallory believed that there was some type of crampon that would have better supported the climbing, but that they were not provided to the expedition. It is not clear exactly what he is referring to, but if it was a lighter type of metal crampon, these could only be used on the snow slopes, as such metal breaks easily on the long rock traverses on Everest. It would also mean that Mallory would favor rock routes over snow routes, as he views cutting steps while wearing the oxygen equipment to be a difficult problem. Moving on to his next letter, on March 30th, Mallory wrote that he received Ruth's March 3rd letter and some envelope with enclosures. The enclosures appear to have just been newspaper clippings about events back in England. Then on April 2nd, Mallory writes to both Ruth and David Cranage. The letter to Ruth is just stuff about the weather and the trek across Tibet. The letter to David Cranage discusses a schedule for lectures upon Mallory's return. This is the only letter to someone other than Ruth that it is in the Magdalen archives for the 1924 expedition. While Mallory certainly wrote to other people, we simply do not have those letters. However, just 3 days after receiving the letter from Ruth indicating their financial problems, Mallory wrote to Cranage, his boss, for the Cambridge lectures, and the letter is about arranging Everest lectures for December and January. The Everest lectures would not be directly through Cambridge, as the Everest Committee handled them. Mallory is just letting his boss know about his expected schedule for the lectures and stating that many of them would use the Cambridge venues. Thus, he's sort of positioning it as a win-win for him and his current employer. Mallory does hedge the letter by saying he will have to wait to see what happens, a fairly obvious statement. So given that Mallory wrote to his employer about the upcoming lecture series just after receiving the letter from Ruth about the financial issues, it would appear that Mallory was expecting the income from those lectures to address the financial problems mentioned in the letter he had just received. Looking at Mallory's earnings from the lectures on the 1922 expedition, he was paid £400 for the lectures in England and a slightly lesser amount for the lectures in the United States. The exact amount he made for the U.S. lectures in Canada is not clear, but somewhere between £200 and £300. Thus, for Mallory, things were starting to come together. He had a job as a lecturer on history and geography, and that paid about £500 a year, and it also given him the time off to go on the 1924 expedition. He could also expect several £1,000s in lecture fees for a successful summit, having received about £650 for 5 months of lecturing about the unsuccessful 1922 expedition. He could expect significantly more if he actually reached the summit. But for this, he has to do just 2 things: actually get to the summit and make it back alive. One point of historical trivia is that in the United States, Mallory was lecturing in the same circuit as Arthur Conan Doyle, and for the New York venue, Conan Doyle managed to pull in $700 more than Mallory. Such lectures typically pull in between $1,000 and $2,000. Thus, at least in the United States, Arthur Conan Doyle was indubitably more popular than Mallory. Returning to the letters, on April 17th, Mallory wrote the Brainwave letter, where he details his plan for the logistics of climbing the mountain with oxygen, and that letter was covered in the Plan video. In terms of the photographs, the reference is in a letter written between April 19th and 24th. Mallory notes, "I have had a very nice long letter from you and also a picture of the children enclosed with the photos from my American friend Schwab illustrating the expedition to Mount Clemenceau. Did you notice the one of Mount Farrar and Mount Mallory? I'm very glad to have the children's picture, but you don't send one of yourself, naughty girl." So Mount Farrar and Mount Mallory are peaks up in Canada. And so while some people focus on the missing photo of Ruth, it is not clear from this letter that George actually had one of her with him on the expedition, and from that letter it would appear that he did not. However, certainly he had a nice long letter from Ruth, and that letter included a photo of their children, and neither the letter nor the photo ever turned up again, even though Ruth's prior letter turned up in Mallory's belongings. However, simply not having a record of something being returned to Mallory's family is not a big deal, because Mallory reported receiving various other letters while on the expedition from his mother, from David Pye, etc., and those have also been lost to history. More curious is that Mallory had 3 letters wrapped in a handkerchief that was found on his body, one from his sister, his brother, and a friend. The 3 letters are fairly routine. His sister was in India at the time, and she was writing about the weather as weather systems were pushed up from the Indian Ocean up into the Himalayas. His brother's letter is a fairly typical brotherly letter, and the letter from his friend Stella is complaining about worker strikes in England, talking about a play she saw, and about a boat race. It is difficult to believe that Mallory did not carry a letter from Ruth and the photo of his children with him. And it should be obvious that the reason Mallory didn't have the letter from Ruth nor the photo of his children was because he left them on the summit. While we do not have the contents of Ruth's long letter directly, Mallory mentions some of the contents in a letter written between the 11th and the 16th of May. He indicates he is happy the sale of the Holt is nearly completed, and that he received letters from Claire and Beeridge, Mallory's 2 daughters, ages 8 and 6. Their son John was much younger, at about 3 years old. Beeridge apparently wrote about crying over the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Mallory claims to have just been thinking about whether the children were being taught the story of Joseph's dream. The rest of Mallory's letters to Ruth read more like an expedition chronology, as they primarily relate to the movement of people and equipment around the mountain. The letters are fairly lengthy and detailed, and thus were included in the expedition report. However, the expedition report deleted any personal portions of the letter, and thus, until the recent publications online by Magdalen College, the full contents was not easily available. The last surviving letter from Mallory is dated May 27th, and he presents a very upbeat appraisal of the situation, perhaps a little too upbeat, as he notes in the margin, P.S., the parts where I boast of my part are put in to please you and not meant for others' eyes. Mallory also notes receiving an additional letter from Ruth, a poem from Claire, and a letter from David Pye. One key piece that was edited out of the letters put into the expedition report is Mallory's writing on May 16th, and this sheds some light on his choice of Irvin. He's writing to Ruth. I must tell you that with immense physical pride, I look upon myself as the strongest of the lot, the most likely to get to the top with or without gas. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Norton thinks the same. He and I were agreeing yesterday that none of the new members, with the possible exception of Irvin, can touch the veterans, and that the old gang are bearing everything on their shoulders and will continue to do so forcefully. The performance of Odell and Hazard on the day they were supposed to reconnoiter the North Col was certainly disappointing, and Beatham has not yet recovered his form. None of these 3 has shown that he has any real guts. It is an effort to pull oneself together and do what is required high up, but it is the power to keep the show going when you don't feel energetic that will enable us to win through if anything does. Irvin has much more of the winning spirit. He has been wonderfully hardworking and brilliantly skillful with the oxygen. Against him is his youth, though it is very much for him some ways. Hard things seem to hit him a bit harder, and his lack of mountaineering training and practice, which much tells to some extent when it comes to climbing rocks or even saving energy on the easiest ground. However, he'll be an ideal campaigning companion and with as stout a heart as you could wish to find. If each of us keeps up his strength as it is at present, we should go well together. So that letter pretty much confirms what many people had long suspected, that Irvin was chosen because of his skill with the oxygen equipment, his youthful athleticism, and that he wouldn't ask any of the tough questions. Turning back to the photo of his children, people would point out that there is no definitive proof that Mallory took them with him up the mountain. But, as with all the evidence relating to their climb, it all points solidly in the direction of them having reached the summit. You can, of course, believe that Mallory left the letter from Ruth and the photo of his children back in base camp and only took up 3 rather mundane letters to keep him company on the mountain. But a rational person would think that it is far more likely that he took a letter from Ruth and the photo of their children as he climbed the mountain. And it doesn't take a Yeti to figure out why they were no longer in his pockets when he died.